Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, the 27th of September, and you are watching episode 106 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight into issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode is Dr. David Wachenfeld. David is formerly the Chief Scientist for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority and is now the Research Program Director of Reef Ecology and Monitoring at the Australian Institute of Marine Science, Townsville. David has worked on the Great Barrier Reef for over 30 years in a career spanning tourism, marine park management and science. He leads a team of 40 scientists who study the coral reefs of the Great Barrier Reef, including long-term ecological health, impacts of climate change, including changes to ecological functions, new technologies for monitoring reef ecosystems, health, tracking movements of large reef animals, modelling and decision support for the reef restoration. His team also works with communities in coral reef countries around the world to improve global monitoring of reef health. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much, Bill. Great to be here.
If you can give us a bit of biography in regards to, obviously, you weren't born in Australia, you're educated in London. So if you could give us a bit of background of your youth in regards to how you found your way to Australia and into our waters.
Well, I've got a story with a few twists in it. So I grew up in London. My parents loved snorkeling and scuba diving. Before I was born, they had lived in Saudi Arabia, so they had spent a fair bit of time snorkeling and diving in the Red Sea. And when I was a boy, we started going on holidays to initially Greece, which is where I learned to snorkel. And then I was lucky enough that my parents took me on a holiday to the Seychelles, which is where I had my first scuba dive. And I was also at the same time growing up on a diet of Jacques Cousteau documentaries on the TV. And I was 8 when I told my parents that I wanted to be a marine biologist. And I think they thought that was very cute. But they probably figured that I might want to be an astronaut a week later and maybe a fireman a week later, and who knows what I was actually going to do. But presumably I would be an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer or something else, but I certainly wouldn't actually be a marine biologist. But I never changed my mind. Right through school, there's only one thing I ever wanted to do, and that was be a marine biologist. And the more time I spent diving and snorkeling and studying biology, that love just got cemented. And I forget how old I was, Bill, maybe 24, 25. And I got an opportunity to come to Australia, I thought, for 2 or 3 years. But I came to North Queensland, to Townsville, and I started to explore the Great Barrier Reef and the rainforests as well around here. And I just fell in love. I couldn't possibly have imagined being anywhere more fantastic, and the notion that I was going to go back and live in England seemed like a terrible idea. And look, Townsville, North Queensland, far North Queensland are absolutely amazing places to live and work if you're a marine biologist, especially if your passion is coral reefs, which mine is. I often liken it to somebody who works in IT getting to go and live and work in Silicon Valley in California. This is one of the global epicenters of expertise in marine science and coral reefs. And when I came here, I was like a kid in a candy shop, scientifically speaking. And as you said in the introduction, I sort of did a variety of different things, got some jobs in science, got some jobs in marine park management, ended up working for a couple of years in reef tourism on a liveaboard dive boat, then got a job with marine parks, and now I'm at the Australian Institute of Marine Science. So, I've also worked in places like Tanzania and Egypt, visited a lot of countries, seen a lot of amazing things under the water and seen a lot of beautiful coral reefs. But I've never seen anything to match the Great Barrier Reef for size and beauty and diversity. You know, I've been diving on the Great Barrier Reef for 30 years, and I still see things I've never seen before when I go out there, simply because it's so huge and there's such an amazing diversity of plants and animals and reefs and islands that are out there. It's an incredible place. So I've been unbelievably lucky to have a passion and to follow it, and to really land on my feet here in Queensland on the Great Barrier Reef.
All right, you sold the job of marine biologist to a lot of people out there, but surely there must be some mundane parts of it that sort of a bit arduous or boring or something, besides all the exciting bits.
Oh, and look, you know, when I say that I'm passionate about it and I love it, I don't mean to give the impression that, you know, it's all sort of cuddling dolphins and watching whales and just sort of floating around in a beautiful tropical ocean. You know, even here on the Great Barrier Reef, marine biologists have to cope with, you know, 30, 40 knot winds, squalls. If you've lived here for a while, in the winter, it's pretty bloody cold out there in the water. So, and you know, also at the end of the day, I think these days all jobs have got their element of spending time on the computer, doing emails, going to meetings. I think, you know, almost everybody does that to a greater or lesser extent, and marine biology is no different, unfortunately. But at the same time, although yes, there are some challenging parts, there are some mundane, even dull sometimes parts. If it's what really makes you passionate, and all the people I know who work in marine science, especially on the Great Barrier Reef, are very passionate about what they do, it's just such an amazing place to be, and a privilege to be able to do what we do, I think.
Well, the other thing is it's such a huge structure, natural structure. I'll just chuck up a screen so you can just give a bit of an overview of the Barrier Reef and how far up and down it you've travelled. So on the screen we've got the Great Barrier Reef, basically going from Cape York, tip at the peninsula, basically down. I think the lowest point is a small island near Bundaberg. Lady Ellard Island is the southernmost extremity.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, that line, and Bill, I've got to apologize, I'm red-green colorblind, so I'm not sure what color that line is. That's the outline of the marine park, that one.
Oh, that's red and green.
Okay, that might be why it's confusing me. So that line is the boundary of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park.
Yep.
And what's interesting is that the northern boundary, which is just off the screen at the top there, that's level with the very northern tip of Cape York. That's where the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park ends. There you go. But actually, as you can see now, the Great Barrier Reef itself as a geographical feature continues beyond the northern boundary of the Great Barrier Reef. In fact, it goes right up into the Torres Strait and beyond the Torres Strait and ends just south of Papua New Guinea. So there you go. So, you know, all those little black squiggly lines and dots that are there north of the boundary of the marine park, those are still the Great Barrier Reef from a geographical and an ecological perspective. They're just not actually in the marine park. And then you've got those more offshore reefs like Ashmore. Then as you move south, as you're doing now, that's 2,300 kilometers of coastline. That is where the Great Barrier Reef stretches along. And that marine park is almost 350,000 square kilometers. And so if the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park were a country, and you put it on a list with the area of all the countries in the world, the Great Barrier Reef would actually be bigger than 2/3 of the countries that exist in the world. So, you know, as you go down that list, down that map, there's so many iconic places. You know, there's Lizard Island, there's Magnetic Island, there's the Whitsundays, all sorts of different reefs. There is a tendency to just say coral reef, but there's so many different sorts of coral reef, different geological features, different sorts of plants and animals. And then, as you said, right down in the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef is the Capricorn Bunker Group, where there are some very famous places like Heron Island and Lady Elliot Island, which are both outstandingly beautiful and great places to visit, to snorkel and to dive. And, you know, people come from all over the world to look at the Great Barrier Reef, and most of them will probably only visit the reef for a day or two. So they get to see one tiny little pinprick in this vast ecosystem. And I've been diving here for 30 years. And I still think there's far more of it that I have not seen than I have, because it's just that huge.
And therein lies a big problem, is the management of such a large piece of landscape that's under the water, or most of it's under the water. I mean, there's a few things popping up out of the sea, but most of it. So can you give us a bit of an overview, because you were the chief scientist of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and now you're in AIMS, and we've got state government and federal government having a bit of a bet each way on different things. And then there's a lot of private foundations as well. I think one of the most famous foundations was Great Barrier Reef Foundation, that got $440 million of taxpayers' money just off the, Mr. Turnbull pulled it out of his shirt pocket, you know. So how do all these people work in together? And especially, how do you sort of encourage foundation, you know, private enterprises and foundations, how to work in and be collaborative rather than sort of going their own little way?
That's a big question, Bill. So, as I said before, the Great Barrier Reef is a marine park, not the entire geographic extent of it, but probably 95% of it is a marine park. That marine park was declared in 1975. And although the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act is an act of federal parliament, so that the act establishes the boundary of the park, it establishes the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority to manage and protect the park. It's a federal government act, but the management arrangements are for the federal government through the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority and the Queensland government through the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service to manage the park jointly. So the field management program, the program of rangers and boats and people that are out there on a day-to-day basis looking after the Great Barrier Reef, you'll often see people with both Commonwealth government and state government logos on their shirt, and the vessels are co-badged as well, because the state and federal governments 50-50 pay for that field management program. And they do everything from just educating people about the park and what you can do where, to looking after the islands. Those are also the people that are looking after a lot of the island infrastructure. They're making sure that people are doing the right things as they're boating and fishing out there. So there's a big educational role, but also a compliance role. Then the Australian Institute of Marine Science, which is where I work now, we're a scientific organisation, not a marine park management organisation. So we're out there conducting research, both to understand what's happening with the reef, what are the pressures on the reef, the ups and downs, but also looking to improve the ways that we can protect the reef for the future. And AIMS is also actually about much more than the Great Barrier Reef. So we have 3 bases, one in Townsville, one in Darwin, and one in Perth. And our area of interest is throughout Australia's tropical marine environment. So, you know, we've got people working all around the tropical coastline. We've got 2 large research vessels, the Cape Ferguson and the Solander. They travel throughout Australia's tropics. We've got smaller research vessels as well, based in those 3 locations, and scientists in all 3 locations looking at how the entirety of Australia's tropical marine environment is doing, particularly the coral reefs, because there are amazing coral reef systems on the west coast as well. They're probably not quite as famous as the Great Barrier Reef, but they're still amazing. They're home to an amazing diversity of plants and animals. Coral reefs throughout Australia's tropics are really important to traditional owners, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. There's lots of places where tourism is really important. So we're there doing the science anywhere in Australia's tropics to try and support those industries, help them be sustainable and protect our tropical marine environments. You've also got the Department of Environment in Canberra. Now, they don't so much work on the water itself, but they do a lot of work on the land, particularly with farmers, trying to reduce pollution to the reef and make sure that water quality is as good as it can be. And a lot of that activity on the Great Barrier Reef is coordinated through a plan called the Reef 2050 Plan, or its full name is the Reef 2050 Long-Term Sustainability Plan. Now, the Reef 2050 Plan is a joint plan between the Queensland and Australian governments, and it's there to provide an overarching framework to help the work on the land, the work in the marine environment, the work by the state government, the work by the federal government, to try and coordinate all of that to deliver the best outcome that we can for the Great Barrier Reef. And you're absolutely right. There's also charitable or philanthropic and non-government or private organizations with an interest in the reef. We try to collaborate with all of those. Some collaborate more than others, that's fine. But I think the thing about the Great Barrier Reef that I don't know if everybody who lives here realizes is that it's globally famous. If you travel the world and tell people that you live next to the Barrier Reef, or you fish on the Great Barrier Reef, or you take your family snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef, I reckon more than any other marine environment anywhere in the world, people almost everywhere have heard of the Great Barrier Reef. It's that famous. So it's not surprising there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of investment, a lot of visitors. The tourism industry is huge and such an important part of our regional economy. So yeah, there are lots of people, lots of organizations with an interest in the reef, and lots of investment in the reef. There's also a lot of other investment in science. So there's the CSIRO, they do work on the Great Barrier Reef. A number of universities work on the Great Barrier Reef, particularly James Cook, which has got campuses in a number of places, but particularly Townsville and Cairns. So there is a huge amount of activity, you're absolutely right, and sometimes coordinating it all does get a bit challenging, but we do everything we can.
In regards to the demarcation between the reef and the corals and the sea life, is there a set sort of departments or breakup of portfolios of that manage different aspects of the reef as far as that goes in the science field?
For the most part, no. I think for the most part, it's more done by what sort of activities are people doing. So, for example, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority manages commercial tourism in the park. It manages science and research in the park. They do manage fishing in the sense that there's a zoning plan that says what kind of activity, particularly fishing, you can do in different places. But then you've also got the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, I think it is, and they manage fisheries. So the rules, for example, about bag limits, size limits, any seasonal closures, those are all done by Fisheries Queensland. So the one thing where it is a bit like the way you described is that there is a bunch of Queensland legislation that is explicitly about protecting marine plants, so particularly mangroves and seagrasses. So if you want to do something like clearing mangroves for a development or a marina, or dredging seagrass for a channel, marine plants in Queensland are very highly protected. And that's definitely a Queensland government thing about protecting those marine plants. So I think probably the management is more about where and what kind of activity people are doing than it is about whether it's corals or fish or seagrass or whatever.
Well, being from Cairns, somehow we feel like we get the short end of the stick when it comes to dredging. Townsville seems to do what it likes, and we get bloody small amount of dredging, and then we've got to put it on land. So I don't know where the fairness comes in between Townsville and Cairns on this issue, but I think we've been sort of shortchanged for a long time on our dredging of the port. And I mean, dredging's a fairly critical thing if you want to keep your ports and that open. But we seem to have come unstuck with try to knock us down to being a boutique port, whatever that is. And so you can have very limited dredging. And I mean, our last lot of dredging, it cost about $125 million to get next to nothing out and put it up on landfill. So now I suppose Cairns will always have a gripe with Townsville in those matters.
Well, Bill, I've lived in Townsville for 31 years now, and I've been to Cairns many times. I actually, love going to Cairns to go diving. And I've never quite understood the rivalry between Townsville and Cairns, but by crikey, it's passionate. I think they're both awesome places. I've got to be honest, I really don't know much about the dredging of ports, but I do know that Queensland has a ports master plan, which is, charts out the future of what uses different ports are for, and you'd have to ask somebody with more expertise than me in that to answer that question. But I've always been a bit puzzled by the nature of the rivalry between Townsville and Cairns. I think they're both awesome places.
I think it's just the master plan from Brisbane to make sure we're sort of each looking at each other's pocket and squabbling rather than pick on the real enemy that was Brisbane and its short change of money for the regions.
And the only thing that overshadows the Townsville Cairns rivalry is the regional Queensland Brisbane rivalry. so that's another interesting one. Yeah, look, I just don't know about the dredging. Sorry.
Just on another point in regards to the boundaries of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, to a degree, it comes fairly close to the coast, and a lot of coastal, very close to the coast, reef systems are in it. They're influenced by the tide, depending on the high tide, low tide, king tides, or very shallow tide sort of things, and getting exposed to the sun. Do you think it would have been more reasonable that the boundary was, it didn't include all those small inshore reefs to be managed as well?
That's an interesting question. Look, it's true that the majority of the coral reefs in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, but even if you look at shallow and deep coral reefs, it probably adds up to 15% or so of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. And the rest is all sorts of different environments, seagrass meadows, mangrove forests, islands take up a bit of room, but there's all kinds of weird and wonderful marine habitats in between the coral reefs, like sponge gardens, algal meadows, and all sorts of things. Some of the Great Barrier Reef is just sort of flat sand and muddy bottom, which has got its own different kinds of plants and animals. I guess the thing about the coral reefs of the Great Barrier Reef is that although if you just look at the area of coral reef, not that much of it is close to the coast, but the places that are close to the coast are of incredible value for coastal communities. So, places like Magnetic Island, Dunk Island, Green Island is a bit further off, but still fairly close. The Whitsundays are right there on the coast off Airlie Beach, the Keppels, the family group, I could just keep going, the Franklins. Those are a lot of the places that are most accessible to people, especially people with smaller boats. Those are the places that a lot of families get to go to with kids. That's where a lot of people go for their first snorkel if they live along this coastline. And so I do think that those are really important habitats in their own right, and a lot of them are really iconic places. So they've also got their own sort of suite of biodiversity. Like if you're actually out there looking at species of corals, species of fish, you're not always going to see the same things on those reefs that are close to the coast than the ones that are offshore. So yeah, I think it does make sense that they're also protected, and they're also just part of the same ecosystem. They're all connected by the water, by the tides, by the currents. A lot of animals move inshore and offshore with different parts of their life cycle. So a lot of people would probably be familiar with red emperor or mangrove jacks, the two different species of fish. But both of those use very different parts of the Great Barrier Reef during their life cycle. In fact, the mangrove jack, actually, when it's a tiny little fish, a juvenile, they'll be right up rivers. I think the furthest upstream that we've ever found a mangrove jack baby is about 150 kilometers. So that's, fully fresh water up in rainforests, billabongs, whatever. And then as they grow, they migrate back out through the river mouth. They spend time in the estuaries. They go spend time in seagrass beds, sponge gardens, whatever it might be. And then as adult mangrove jack, they're further offshore on the coral reefs. So the plants and animals of the Great Barrier Reef don't see it the way that we do. They don't go, oh, that's close to coast, we don't go there, or, I only stay offshore. So I think if you want to protect the Great Barrier Reef as an ecosystem, it's really important that we protect everything from right up to the coastline to the offshore reefs, and even some of that deep environment that we were talking about before we started broadcasting. And I think that's the way people should think about the Great Barrier Reef, as a vast system. It's all interconnected. It's all important. Different parts of it support each other. And that's one of the things that makes it so special. Yes, it's huge. And you can break it down into little bits. Like you can talk about 3,800 coral reefs, so you can say seagrass beds or whatever. But the plants and animals don't see it that way. For them, it's one huge interconnected system. I think that's how people should see it as well. And of course, that is also how traditional owners see it. They don't see a distinction between the land and the sea and the coral reefs and the seagrass beds, and they see themselves as part of that vast ecosystem as well. And I think that's how everybody should think about it.
Well, it's interesting there because a lot of people don't sort of understand with the Indigenous people. Well, they didn't have scuba diving stuff, so how do they have any connection to the reef? But when I was talking to Rob Beeman and Sean Elm, it was interesting to see that when the Indigenous arrived in Australia, we were at the depths of a glacial period, and the sea was 120 meters shallower than it was now, lower. And with the submergibles, you could, and the images that they took, you could see that where the mouth of the Fitzroy River was, almost 50 kilometers further out to where it is now. And so the Indigenous people, there was no Great Barrier Reef as we know it today. When they arrived, their shoreline was a long way out and probably very much closer to the continental shelf drop than we are. And but so they actually walked and hunted on the land that is now underwater on the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah. And I just think that's such an amazing story, and the work of people like Rob and Sean is so important for helping us understand that bigger picture. So, as you said, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people arrived here something like 60 or 70,000 years ago. The sea level was 120 meters lower than it is now. And this is the bit that I know it's true, but I struggle to think what it looked like. The whole continental shelf that is now where the Great Barrier Reef sits was dry land. And because, again, tens of thousands of years earlier than that, the sea level had been high again and there were coral reefs there, what would have looked like to Aboriginal people arriving in Australia for the first time, like a series of limestone hills, presumably with grass and trees and wallabies jumping around all over the place. If they dug down under the soil, they would have found, coral skeletons from tens of thousands of years earlier. So, as we go from ice age to between ice ages, sea level falls and then rises because more and less water in the ocean is tied up in the ice sheets and the poles. And I can't imagine, generation after generation of Aboriginal people living on the coastline of the Great Barrier Reef, and the sea level is just slowly rising, and
not slowly at times. Yeah. I mean, as we change from the glacial period to the interglacial, because we've been in an ice age for nearly 2 million years. What we do is go from glacial to interglacial periods, and we've been through that probably 10, 12 more times. So we're probably on the 15th reincarnation of the Great Barrier Reef. But some of those the coastal shoreline that you set up your camp on could rapidly disappear, especially as you leapt from the glacial period to interglacial, because the actual it was a fairly fast rise of sea level at that period, and now we're at the sort of plateau of the interglacial, and we're sort of bumping along in and out of hot periods, warm period, cool periods, and the sea level fluctuates a little bit, because you can see that in the Mediterranean, where in the Roman times, yeah, you find lighthouses that are inland, whereas in the Roman times they would have been right on the shoreline. So it's a dynamic earth we've got, and a dynamic sea. So this incarnation of the Great Barrier Reef, the water level came up around about 20,000 years ago, covered it. And how long has the reef as it is, the coverage, how long has this incarnation been, do you think? So
I think the sea level sort of stabilized between about 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. Sea level is incrementally rising now because the planet is warming up, and water expands as it gets warmer. But roughly speaking, the Great Barrier Reef as we know it today is about 6,000 years old. But you're absolutely right. If you take a geological time period and you're looking back over millions of years, then the Great Barrier Reef has come and gone as sea level has gone up and down. So if that's your time frame, it's a very dynamic and changing system, and it's changed many times. I suppose that's the problem. We're only here in comparison to geological times, we're only here for a blink of an eye. So we've got a fairly false impression that everything should remain the same forever. Nothing should ever change. But we've just had 3 years of La Nina, and we've got some good cover now on the reef. But we're heading into an El Nino system, so there's a bit of worry. Do you think we overly worry about these sort of things in regards to sort of it becomes agonizing to scientists and the people who want to protect the reef that these things occur, or should it be, well, we've just got to bounce it out and sort of manage it the best we can? We can't actually get there and keep throwing cold water on it or something like that. Sure. Look, I don't know if you think your audience understands the difference between El Nino and La Nina, but I'll explain it if you ask me to in broad terms. But it's a major driver of the weather that we get in Australia. One brings warmer, drier weather, and the other brings cooler, wetter weather. Is the short story. And that's a natural phenomenon. I don't know what the earliest record of El Nino and La Nina changing over time is, but it's been like that for as long as we have been studying weather. So I don't think anybody should worry about the sort of natural cycle of El Nino and La Nina. I think the real issue is that since we discovered fossil fuels and we've been burning fossil fuels, we've put an awful lot of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. That kind of acts like a blanket over the Earth, and the Earth is now 1.1 degree, or it may actually now be 1.2, I've heard, warmer than it was a couple of hundred years ago before the Industrial Revolution. So the thing is now, when we talk about, well, El Nino is relatively warm, La Nina is relatively cool, that's still true, but everything is working off a warmer baseline than it would have been 150 or 200 years ago. So back to your point about human lives are very short if you're thinking about geological timeframes. The Earth has gone through huge upheavals in geological timeframes, millions of years. but people don't live for millions of years. So things that happen over decades are really important to us. And so I think that balance between, yep, you know, weather's going to change, El Nino, La Nina, there's the Indian Ocean dipole, there's lots of other things that influence the weather in Australia. But the challenge for us is that as we continue to put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we're actually seeing the temperature just creep up slowly, slowly, slowly. And when I say slowly, by geological standards, it's not slow at all. We're actually making the temperature go up much faster than it's ever gone up in as far as we can tell in geological history. That's the bit that I think is driving the concern. So if a scientist says, oh, for example, I'm worried that we're now in an El Nino, that may well mean that we get marine heat waves and coral bleaching this coming summer. It's not so much the El Nino that's driving the concern, it's the underlying warming of the planet with climate change that means that the consequences of the El Nino are probably different and regrettably worse than they would have been 200 or 250 years ago. And I think that's the bit that we need to grapple with, you know, how much change are we willing to put up with? You know, we should probably talk about, you know, how the health of the Great Barrier Reef has bounced up and down, but I think that's the issue. It's not just natural weather cycles, it's natural weather cycles interacting with the way that people have changed the atmosphere and are changing the climate.
In regards to, well, the carbon dioxide is the greenhouse gas that most people are aware of. But it's a very critical part of our life cycle. I mean, without CO2, we don't live. You know, plants don't live, then we don't live. So, so finding the right level is sort of, you know, if you look as a marine biologist, you'd be aware, like all the limestone that was formed, you know, over time. Well, 40% of that is carbon dioxide by weight, and that used to be in the atmosphere. Now, the breathing apparatus of when it warms, the sea will expel some carbon dioxide, and then when it gets cool, it takes it in. How important is CO2 level in the sea for, say, shellfish and that? Wouldn't the CO2 in the water be part of the mechanism that creates the casings for crabs and the outer shells for shellfish and that?
So look, I mean, you know, let's be clear, all life on Earth is made from carbon, and there's a lot of oxygen in there as well, and all of the plants and animals that photosynthesize make sugar from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So, you know, trees, grasses, you know, all the fruits and vegetables that we eat have all grown by plants taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and converting it into sugars and other organic matter. It might surprise people that I said animals photosynthesize, and technically I'm fudging a bit there. It's not the animals themselves that photosynthesize, but animals, for example, like most corals and giant clams that people might be familiar with, anemones, sea anemones, you know, they've all got these tiny little algae inside them. And those algae do what all algae do. They take the energy from sunlight, they take carbon dioxide, and they turn it into sugar and other organic material. So absolutely, critically important. But the issue is the rate at which we're changing it. So, you know, if you think about the planet before humans discovered fossil fuels and started burning them and changing things, there's a natural carbon cycle. So, you know, carbon is taken out of the atmosphere, it's put into plants, animals eat the plants, some animals eat other animals, plants and animals die. Some of that gets released back into the atmosphere, but a lot of it gets locked up under the ground through geological processes like coal, the formation of coal and oil and gas, for example. So, you know, coal and oil used to be plants and animals millions of years ago. When we discovered that we could unlock energy from coal and oil, we kind of broke that cycle. We took a lot of carbon that was locked up under the ground and we burned it to make energy, which is fantastic, don't get me wrong. But we took a lot of that locked up carbon under the ground and we put it back into the atmosphere. Now, you know, there's probably times in the Earth's history, millions of years ago, where there was that much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere before. But the issue is people are changing things really quickly. And you spoke before about how people want things to change, stay the same, but our planet is a dynamic one. That's very true. We're actually making it more dynamic. We're making things change more quickly than they've ever changed before. And part of the problem with that is there's now 8 billion of us, and lots of us live close to coastlines. We've all got, you know, houses and live in blocks of units or whatever it is. We can't just pick up sticks and move because the climate's changing and there's too much rainfall or not enough rainfall, there's a drought, or now this area is bushfire prone, or sea levels rising and there's coastal erosion. So this is really about the balance that people want between where we get our energy, what we want the atmosphere to look like. It's not about, you know, that carbon dioxide is a bad thing. It's about how much carbon dioxide, because there were 290 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And I know that doesn't sound like much, but that was before the pre-industrial revolution, and now we're over 400. So we've made some big changes. And in terms of the physical effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it makes a big difference to how much heat the atmosphere how much heat the atmosphere traps. So your point is absolutely right. You know, we need carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's always been carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's about how quickly do we want to be changing it and how far do we want to change it, and what are the consequences of how much we do that, and the speed at which we do that for our tourism industry, our local communities, our fishing industry, the health of the reef, and lots of other things as well.
Yeah, just moving on in regards to monitoring the reef.
Yep.
We've got, you know, the World Heritage listing, and every once in a while there's a threat to remove the listing because, you know, something dramatic happened on the reef. How important is that World Heritage listing? And if it disappeared, would people stop coming to the reef?
That's an interesting question. So, first of all, I really want to emphasize for people that I'm not aware of anybody talking about removing the World Heritage listing. There is a category of World Heritage listing called World Heritage in Danger. And that's simply a system to draw attention to the threats that might exist to a World Heritage area, and you know, different World Heritage areas, those threats could be very different. It's the job of the UNESCO, which is a United Nations scientific and technical body, to provide advice to the World Heritage Committee. It's the job of the World Heritage Committee to make decisions about when somewhere gets added to the list or gets put on the list of in danger. So the discussion about the Great Barrier Reef is whether or not to make it World Heritage in Danger. And World Heritage in Danger is still World Heritage. I think the thing that people should realize is that there are 29 World Heritage areas in the world that have got coral reefs in them. And all 29 of them are equally vulnerable to climate change. In fact, you know, some of them are more vulnerable than the Great Barrier Reef, some of them are less. Great Barrier Reef is kind of in the middle of the pack. But coral reefs are kind of like a canary in the coal mine for climate change, because corals are so sensitive to increases in temperature. So it's not surprising that all 29 of those World Heritage areas are under threat from climate change. I think the issue goes back to what I said before, which is that the Great Barrier Reef is really famous. I reckon almost everybody in the world has heard of the Great Barrier Reef. And it's probably more famous than any other World Heritage area that's got coral reefs in it. So I think, although if you ask any technical expert, any scientist, they know that all global World Heritage coral reefs. Indeed, all coral reefs are at threat from climate change, as are polar ice caps, as are glaciers and other things. But the Great Barrier Reef is just so famous that if you want to attract attention to concerns about impacts of climate change on the planet, on World Heritage, it's an obvious one to choose to draw attention to the concern. It doesn't mean it's the only place that is at risk from climate change. So I certainly know that the tourism industry on the Great Barrier Reef does like to draw attention to the fact that it's a World Heritage area. I do think that helps with, drawing people's attention. It's one of the reasons it's as famous as it is. It's part of the reason why some people come. I think, whether or not it gets put on the list of World Heritage in danger, that's up to UNESCO and the World Heritage Committee. But the reality is that the Great Barrier Reef will be an amazing place to visit for many decades to come. There will be places that are degraded, that are not so great anymore. And we're already seeing that, it's a rapidly shifting ecosystem. But I think that even with degradation, there will still be amazing places to visit. And again, remembering the Great Barrier Reef itself, the marine park, is bigger than 2/3 of the countries on the planet. Most visitors will see a tiny little pinprick. And the tourism industry will always show people the best of what the Great Barrier Reef has to offer. And that's what I would focus on. We want to love and protect the whole of this amazing ecosystem. But it will still be an amazing place for tourists to visit because they'll only see small bits of it.
I think the interesting thing about it, Bud, is the government almost has kittens when there's a threat of it being listed as endangered, and they go out of their way to sort of, run around and throw more money at it or whatever. And then you've got the tourism industry that doesn't want that to happen, and then you've got activists saying, well, it should have been on the endangered list ages ago, sort of thing. So this is where a lot of ordinary people like myself get confused sometimes, that you've got all these conflicting things in regards to, well, what's the status of the Great Barrier Reef and how's it faring? And you get so many, there's activists who says it's dying and we need to do more, and they use it as a poster boy to take action and bash the farmers or whatever. So it's a bit weird, but you did write a paper not just long ago, or a commentary on actually, is it reviving or dying? So can you give us a bit of your brief from that? Yeah.
So I think it's really important. I think that people who don't actually work on the Great Barrier Reef, and obviously if you work on the Great Barrier Reef, you kind of live and breathe it, you're constantly reading and learning and so on. But if you don't live and breathe it, and you just get the occasional media article or Facebook post or whatever it might be, I would imagine it's pretty confusing, because the Great Barrier Reef has been changing a lot in recent years. Especially the last 10 to 15 years. So we use a metric that we call coral cover as kind of one of the headline measures of the health for the coral reefs of the Great Barrier Reef. And it's really simple. So if you just imagine that you're looking at an area of reef that's in front of you and it's the size of a football field, and half of it is hard coral cover and half of it is something else, we say that's 50% coral cover. Right? So we're not counting soft coral, seaweed, sand, all the other stuff that's out there. We're just talking about the hard coral. And the reason why that's such an important metric of reef health is that it's the hard corals that actually build the coral reefs, right? They build the structure that you can see from space. They build the Great Barrier Reef. They provide the habitat for about 16,000 species of animals, everything from the tiniest little shrimp to a whale shark, built by the corals. So they're critically important. Without the hard corals, we wouldn't have the Great Barrier Reef at all. That's why we use that as a measure of reef health. It's not the only measure, but it's a really good headline measure. The same way, probably if you go and see your doctor, the first thing they will do is take your pulse. It's not the only measure of your health, but it's a really good headline measure. Now, that measure on the Great Barrier Reef has been bouncing up and down like crazy for the last 15 years. We saw some of the lowest levels of coral cover 10 or so years ago. And in particular, we saw low levels after bleaching events, and so bleaching as a consequence of marine heat waves, which again is driven by climate change. And we saw really bad impacts in 2016 and 2017, really serious marine heat waves. Lots of coral died in the shallow parts of the Great Barrier Reef. And I hate to say it, but a lot of places that I knew well that looked amazing suddenly looked terrible. All the coral was dead. It looked awful. Now, you made reference to this. We haven't had extreme weather kill a lot of coral on the Great Barrier Reef since 2017. So for more than 6 years now, the Great Barrier Reef has had a bit of a reprieve from extreme weather, and it has demonstrated how resilient it is, which is fantastic. So lots of reefs have recovered really strongly. We tend to report this metric coral cover on the northern, central, and southern Great Barrier Reef to kind of summarize things. Last year, all three, the northern, central, and southern, had the highest coral cover that we've ever seen. Actually, sorry, northern and central did, southern wasn't quite the highest. Now, that sort of huge recovery we've seen over 7 years seems to have kind of stabilized now. It's not continuing as quickly. In fact, the northern, central, and southern have gone down a little bit in the last year, but going down a little bit is not a big deal. So, you know, whether or not it's World Heritage in danger, that's somebody else's decision. But the truth is that the Great Barrier Reef in the last 10 to 15 years has both had the biggest impact it's ever had, the lowest coral cover it's ever had, driven by climate change. But then when it caught a break from extreme weather events, it's demonstrated its resilience. And that's fantastic. It is still a huge, dynamic, resilient system. The reason why scientists are worried, Bill, and I think this is the thing for people to realize, is it's not just about where we are today. So I said we're about 1.1, 1.2 degrees warmer than we were about 250 years ago. If that was the end of it, if we, you know, we're stabilizing the temperature now, I reckon the Great Barrier Reef would be okay. But we're not stabilizing temperature now. Things are still getting warmer. We are projected to be at about 1.5 degrees of warming on a global average in the early 2030s, so about 10 years from now. And on current greenhouse gas emissions trajectories, we will be well over 2.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Now, everything we know about corals tells us that they're very sensitive to heat waves. They do not like them. They go through this heat stress response, coral bleaching, and if it's bad enough, they die. It's okay at the moment. Like it's not great. I'd rather not see such big impacts to the Great Barrier Reef. And I feel a bit like we're kind of rolling the dice and taking a gamble that the recovery will happen again. But at the moment, the recovery is happening. As we get to 1.5 degrees, beyond 1.5 into 2, the future is looking very dicey. And coral reefs will be here for hundreds of thousands, probably millions of years. But our fishing industry, our tourism industry, our local communities, our ability to take our kids out and go snorkeling on coral reefs and show them the amazing beauty of the reef, that is going to go away in coming decades if we continue to warm the planet the way we are now. So we need to look at what's happening now, be thankful that the reef is resilient under the current circumstances. But if we want that to stay the way it is, we need to change the way we do things, particularly with greenhouse gases, and deliver a more secure climate and a more secure future for the Great Barrier Reef in coming decades.
With your work with other global partners from AIMS, do you get, there would be areas that are warmer tropics than what we've got on the east coast of Australia. Although we've got the equatorial cycle and our ocean cycle race comes across the equator, then comes down the east coast. So we do get that warm water, whereas West Australia is the other way around. It gets most of its cycle from the southern ocean and comes up from the cool water. But with your other partnerships and you work with other coral reef countries, which is part of your job or the work you do, can you give us an idea of other coral reefs that are sort of in or always cooking sort of thing? Like I think there's places like Palau and that sort of area that is quite warm water as well.
Yeah, look, so in some ways, the global story of coral reef health has had some similarities to the Great Barrier Reef one, in the sense that when it gets really hot, the coral reefs of the world really struggle. And then if there's a period of relatively cool weather, they start to recover. I'm generalizing. Certainly, there are places in the world that got bad impacts from climate change a long time before the Great Barrier Reef did. So the Maldives and the Seychelles, which are both coral island groups in the Indian Ocean, they had terrible impacts in 1998, which was the first global marine heat wave and coral bleaching event. So those places lost more than 90% of their corals in one marine heat wave. The Great Barrier Reef had some coral bleaching back in 1998, but very little mortality. So some places have suffered worse sooner. Generally, and again, I'm really generalizing, most places, if they're given long enough without another cyclone or another marine heat wave, will at least begin to recover, if not fully recover. And so we've seen globally that we can get, and again, this is delivered by this global coral reef monitoring network, of which AIMS is the coordinator. And we've seen that when we get really bad marine heat waves, global coral cover declines. And when we don't get them, global coral cover recovers. But at the moment, we are coming off the back of a really bad series of marine heat waves between 2014 and 2017. And of course, you know, when I say a global marine heat wave, it's hot in the northern hemisphere summer, like June, July, August, and that's when they get coral bleaching. And then we get coral bleaching in the southern hemisphere in our summer, sort of December, January, February. Now, over the last few months, the oceans of the world have been the hottest they've ever been in recorded history. And the northern hemisphere countries, particularly in the Western Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific, so sort of on both sides of the Americas. So I'm talking about countries like the USA, Mexico, Belize, Colombia, countries that have got coral reefs in the northern hemisphere, and their summer has just ended. They've just gone through horrendous coral bleaching. It's still happening. I don't know about all of those countries, but certainly Florida has had a huge amount of coral die in July and August. By far the worst marine heat wave they've ever had. We're now in globally El Nino conditions, so back to that conversation we were having before. And so, you know, once again, there is an elevated concern. We're now in El Nino conditions in Australia as well as global. So there is concern that in our coming summer, it will be unusually hot, unusually dry, and that we will probably be seeing droughts on land. It will probably be a bad bushfire season. The Bureau of Meteorology is doing an excellent job of forecasting how it's likely to be in different places at different times. And we're also likely to get marine heat waves, and that could be in different places around the Australian coastline at different times. But broadly speaking now, when we get an El Nino on top of the warming from climate change, we can expect some pretty harsh weather conditions that are difficult to deal with. So under current conditions, things are challenging, but arguably okay, a little scary. But it's the future that is really worrying, because we're still warming the planet, and ecosystems like coral reefs are just not going to cope with the direction that we're taking in the planet at the moment.
Just touching on another area of monitoring that, monitoring things like fertilizers and pesticides and all the things that come off the land, that falls into your realm as well in regards to monitoring those sort of inputs to the reef.
We don't monitor the inputs, so the Queensland government does most of that. We do monitor the water quality and the health of the ecosystem out on the reef. And I guess that, you know, monitoring is just one part of science, monitoring the health of the system. The other side of this, of course, is doing the science that helps us know how to help deliver a better future. And that's a really important part of what AIMS is doing as well. So we do a lot of research in how to improve crown of thorn starfish control, because that will help protect the Great Barrier Reef. We're doing a whole bunch of research into what we call reef restoration and adaptation. That's about new techniques to help reefs survive better under climate change. We're also doing work in things like blue carbon. I don't know if people know what blue carbon is, but it's basically ecosystems, marine ecosystems that have got a lot of plant material, so salt marshes, mangrove forests, seagrass beds, algal meadows, are all places where plants are growing in the marine environment. They're sucking carbon out of the water, that sucks carbon out of the air, and that actually can help, we think, lock up carbon for the future and improve the future for coral reefs and other marine ecosystems. So, you know, yes, we are out there monitoring water quality, we are out there monitoring ecosystem health, but we're also doing a lot of research and development into techniques and solutions to make the world a better place in the future. And to some extent, that is about buying time for us to get our act together to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as well as just making the world a better place.
I was just thinking in the fact that our farmers have been pretty well beaten around the head seriously in regards to land management and water runoff and things like that. And we're trying to stop, reduce the outflows of sediment and out into the reef from the river systems, but our river systems sort of get a big dunking of rain for a short time, and it usually only goes one way, and that's out to sea. So you always got to get a big bloom of soils and things like that, regardless of the land management. But I just think sometimes the farmers are sort of really sort of hit, and they use, and the reason is they keep using the reef protection as the reason why you got to change. And I was just wondering, seeing that new regulations are come in some years ago, is there any way to find out whether those regulations have sort of added to the value of the reef or protected the reef, or is it just we're not sure?
Well, so I think a few things. First of all, stopping runoff from farms is good for farmers. Like, if you've ever seen really bad soil erosion, I've stood in the bottom of a gully that's 10 meters deep, and that's terrifying. You know, that's 10 meters of soil that a grazier has lost from their land. They don't want that. That's not good for them. It's not good for the cattle. It's not good for the farm. The chemicals that we talk about, particularly the fertilizers, those are really expensive. A farmer has no interest in having fertilizer wash off his land and end up in a river. Whether or not it ends up on the reef doesn't matter. Once it's in the river, it's of no use to the farmer anymore. So a lot of farmers have been really proactive, some motivated by the reef, some motivated by more local issues, some motivated more by the economic benefits of better land management, some by all of those things. So farmers are a really diverse group. I must admit, I don't like it when people talk about beating up farmers. Farmers are a diverse group. Yep, there are farmers who could do a better job than they do. There are others who are already doing amazing work, and I think we need to applaud those farmers and really talk about what they do and how they've done that. At the moment, all of the modelling and monitoring that we have on the catchment, which is generally done by the Queensland government, that is showing us that we are succeeding in reducing levels of particularly some nutrients from fertilizer and sediments coming off the land. That's great. That's good for rivers, it's good for wetlands, it's good for the inshore reef, it's good for farms. But it will take a while before that actually flows all the way through to the inshore seagrass beds and the inshore coral reefs to see a difference. It's a long strategic game, but again, for me, the thing is, there are already a lot of farmers doing great work. We need to talk more about those, and we need to talk more about the local benefits that they've got from doing what they're doing, because they're happy to do it. It works for them. That's
And it
what I
saves money in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, government has provided a lot of money to farmers to help them change their practices. That hasn't persuaded all farmers to do it. That's fine. But, again, I just think, yes, it's a long-term strategic job, but it is definitely worth doing. And, let's look at the farmers who've embraced the change and gotten a lot of benefits out of doing it.
I think one of the more worrying things is the urban population. I mean, I would have to be the most notorious person for using herbicides trying to keep the weeds down on my small suburban block. But you multiply all the dog poos and cat poos and fertilizers and sprays that people use on their garden. I mean, we must, it seems strange that we look at the farmers so much, but then our urban environment, where there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people on a river system, where all our stormwater runs into Trinity Inlet or Ross River or something like that, and yet we're not held accountable. Like, I'd hate to think how many litres of herbicides I've bought in the last 12 years of living up here, trying to control the weeds and other growth up here. Because it just seems you drop a piece of cutting on the ground, and if you don't pick it up and throw it in the garbage, it starts to sprout.
Yeah. So, look, first of all, I think there's a big difference depending on what scale you're thinking about. So if you're looking at one inlet or one bay that is adjacent to a city of 200,000 people, then sure, you may well have a problem. So if you're talking about Trinity Inlet, or if you're talking about Cleveland Bay off Townsville, then urban pollution may well be a local issue. But if you're talking about the scale of the entire inshore Great Barrier Reef, right from the tip of Cape York all the way down to Bundaberg, then the reason that agriculture generates more pollution than urban land is because, although there's more people on the urban land, it's a much smaller footprint. And so, agriculture, especially if you look at cattle farming, it's losing, and it's not losing it from everywhere, obviously, but where farms are losing soil, it's a vast area. The area where we apply fertilizers and agrochemicals is a big area. And so it depends whether you're talking about one small location like Cleveland Bay, or whether you're talking about the whole Great Barrier Reef as to what you would prioritize. But the other thing I would say is that there are a lot of regulations on councils to, what they can and can't do, what people are allowed to do and not allowed to do. I'm a bit worried about how much you might be applying, Bill. Maybe you should go into your council and have a chat to them about what you could do better. I don't know. But I think that with councils, it's important to remember that a lot of the sources are point. So, we've got stormwater drains, we've got sewage outfalls. There's a huge amount invested in clearing plastic rubbish out of stormwater. There's a huge amount invested by councils in treating sewage so that it doesn't create nutrient pollution. But equally, residents have to do the right thing. You talked about cat and dog poo. I don't know about Cairns, but in Townsville, you're not supposed to let your dog poo and then just leave it there. You're supposed to pick it up. So, and I'm not saying everybody does, I'm not silly, but, all of those things come into play, but it's the same thing. I think that there are farmers doing amazing work, and we should be talking about that. There are a lot of councils doing amazing work to reduce pollution to the reef as well, and we should be talking about that.
Okay, look, we've gone over the hour, so we might wrap it up there. If you'd just like to finish up on a note in regards to what exactly some of the projects you're doing at AIMS at this point in time, and what the future holds for the Great Barrier Reef just in a broad way.
Yeah, look, I think obviously I'm kind of guessing that your audience is mostly sort of North Queensland, far North Queensland, or at least regional Queensland adjacent to the reef. How lucky are we? We live next to the Great Barrier Reef. It's bloody amazing. And honestly, if there are people listening who have not been out to see the reef, please go. It's absolutely incredible. AIMS is all about doing science to understand our tropical marine ecosystems, all the way from, you know, about Bundaberg in the east, all the way up the east coast, across the top end, you know, all past the Kimberleys, down the west coast, all the way down to Ningaloo and beyond. It's an absolutely vast area, and it is chock-a-block full of amazing tropical marine environments. They're so important to our tourism industry, to our fisheries, to our traditional owners, to our way of life. And AIMS is all about doing the science to understand those tropical marine environments and to be able to understand what is threatening them and to do everything possible to make our use of those marine environments sustainable and to develop new technologies to protect them into the future. So, you know, I commend people, think about how much you value the marine environment off our coast, and think about the importance of science for delivering a better future for that coast and the people who live here and who use the reefs for work or play. Thanks, Bill. It's been awesome chatting to you.
Thank you. If you just stay on the line for a little bit, I'll just introduce
Sure.
next week's show and just have a quick chat after. So if you enjoyed the show tonight, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please join me next week when I talk to Richard Gilmore, and we'll be talking about fisheries in North Queensland and Queensland in general, and the general cutback in quotas like Spanish mackerel, and also the banning or likelihood of the banning of gill netting in the coastal regions, and the lookout into the Gulf and what's ahead for the fishers there. So please join me next week. We'll have a talk with Richard Gilmore. Thank you.